Welcome to Daily Dose of Knowledge. Procrastination is not laziness. It is not poor time management. It is not a character flaw. It is a neurological event. And until you understand what is actually happening in your brain when you procrastinate, every productivity tip you try will eventually fail. Stay with us and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The self-help industry has been solving the wrong problem for decades. It has been treating procrastination as a time management issue, giving you planners, timers, and to-do lists. But procrastination is not about time. It is about emotion. And that single distinction changes everything about how to actually stop it. Let's start with what neuroscience has confirmed about procrastination. Dr. Fuschia Sirois at the University of Sheffield conducted landmark research establishing procrastination as primarily an emotion regulation failure, not a productivity failure, not a planning failure. An emotion regulation failure. The task you are avoiding is not actually the problem. The negative emotion the task triggers, anxiety, self-doubt, boredom, frustration, is the problem. Procrastination is the brain's attempt to regulate that emotion by avoiding its source. Now let's talk about the brain, because this is where the mechanism lives. The amygdala is the brain's threat detection center. It processes incoming information and decides whether something is dangerous. For most of human history, threats were physical. Predators, enemies, starvation. But the amygdala cannot distinguish between a physical threat and an emotional one. A difficult task that triggers anxiety registers in the amygdala the same way a physical danger does. And when the amygdala registers a threat, it triggers a response. Fight, flight, or freeze. Procrastination is freeze. It is the nervous system's threat response applied to a spreadsheet, an assignment, or a difficult conversation. Now let's go deeper into the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for long-term thinking, impulse control, and goal-directed behavior. It is the part of the brain that understands. This task matters. Finishing it will produce a good outcome. I should do it now. The amygdala and the prefrontal cortex are in constant competition for control of your behavior. In a regulated emotional state, the prefrontal cortex wins. You think clearly, act deliberately, and follow through. In an emotionally activated state, the amygdala wins. The prefrontal cortex goes partially offline. Long-term thinking collapses. The only priority becomes removing the source of discomfort immediately. That removal is procrastination. It works, in the short term. The anxiety drops. The discomfort passes. The brain registers relief. And that relief is the reward that makes procrastination a habit. Now let's talk about the present bias, because this is the cognitive mechanism that makes procrastination feel rational in the moment. The brain assigns more value to immediate rewards than to future rewards. Psychologists call this temporal discounting. The relief of avoiding a task right now is immediately available. The benefit of completing the task, the grade, the outcome, the finished project, is distant and abstract. The brain runs a cost-benefit calculation in real time. Immediate relief always outscores distant benefit. This is why knowing a deadline is coming does not stop procrastination. The prefrontal cortex knows the deadline. The amygdala does not care. It is optimizing for right now. Now let's talk about the procrastination doom loop, because this is what makes it so destructive over time. You avoid the task, relief arrives. But guilt, shame, and self-criticism follow. Those negative emotions make the task feel even more threatening the next time you encounter it. So next time, the amygdala fires harder, the avoidance urge is stronger. The procrastination is deeper, the loop tightens with every cycle. The task becomes more charged with negative emotion. The avoidance becomes more automatic. The gap between intention and action grows wider. Procrastination does not just delay tasks. It makes tasks progressively harder to start. Now let's talk about self-criticism, because this is the part that most people are doing completely wrong. The intuitive response to procrastination is self-criticism. You tell yourself you are lazy, undisciplined, and weak. That self-criticism feels like accountability. It is not. It is additional negative emotion being attached to the task. Research by Dr. Michael Wohl at Carleton University confirmed that self-forgiveness after procrastination
not self-criticism, predicted lower procrastination on the next task.
Self-forgiveness removes the shame layer from the task. The task becomes slightly less threatening. The amygdala fires slightly less intensely. The avoidance urge weakens.
Self-criticism does the opposite.
It loads more negative emotion onto an already emotionally overloaded task.
You are not holding yourself accountable when you criticize yourself for procrastinating. You are making the next episode of procrastination more likely. Now let's talk about what actually works, starting with the most important intervention.
Emotion first, task second.
The conventional approach to procrastination attacks the task directly. Just start, use a timer.
Break it into steps.
Those techniques work sometimes for mildly aversive tasks. They fail consistently for tasks carrying significant emotional charge. The correct sequence is to address the emotional state before attempting the task. Name the emotion. Research by Dr. Matthew Lieberman at UCLA confirmed that labeling an emotion, naming it precisely, reduces
amygdala activation measurably, not metaphorically.
The threat response physically quiets when the emotion is named. I am feeling anxious about this. I am feeling overwhelmed. I am afraid this will confirm I am not capable.
That naming is not weakness. It is neuroscience. And it begins to deactivate the threat response before you even touch the task.
Now let's talk about the second intervention, implementation intentions applied to emotional obstacles. Most implementation intentions address logistics. I will work on this at 3 p.m. at my desk. Research by Peter Gallwitzer extended this to emotional obstacles. When I feel the urge to avoid this task, I will name what I am feeling and take one action anyway. The if-then structure preloads the response to the emotional trigger before the trigger arrives. The brain does not have to make a real-time decision when the anxiety hits. The decision was already made. The response fires more automatically. Now let's talk about the third intervention, task reframing. The amygdala responds to how a task is framed as much as what the task actually involves. A task framed as I have to write this report triggers a threat response. A task framed as I am going to write 3 sentences and stop triggers almost no response.
The size and certainty of the commitment changes the emotional profile of the task entirely. This is the real mechanism behind the 2-minute rule.
Not productivity, threat reduction. A 2-minute commitment is emotionally small enough that the amygdala does not activate.
The task begins. And once begun, the emotional resistance drops dramatically.
Research confirms that task engagement itself produces positive affect.
Starting the task changes the emotional experience of the task. The anticipation is almost always worse than the doing.
Now let's talk about the fourth intervention, self-compassion as a performance strategy.
Dr. Kristin Neff at the University of Texas has documented extensively that self-compassion produces better performance outcomes than self-criticism across multiple domains.
The self-compassionate approach to procrastination. I am struggling with this task and that is understandable. Activates the brain's care system rather than its threat system.
The care system is associated with approach behavior, moving toward things, engaging.
The threat system is associated with avoidance behavior,
moving away from things,
disengaging. Self-criticism activates the threat system.
Self-compassion activates the care system.
And the care system is the one that produces follow-through. This is not soft advice. It is the neuroscience of what actually produces action.
Now let's talk about the fifth intervention, environment design for emotional regulation.
If the amygdala activates in response to the emotional environment around a task, then changing the environment changes the emotional profile of the task.
A cluttered, distraction-filled, uncomfortable work environment adds sensory and psychological noise to an already emotionally loaded task.
The total threat signal increases.
A clean, dedicated, distraction-minimized work environment reduces the background emotional noise.
The task's emotional load stands alone, without additional environmental amplification.
This is why environment design is not a productivity hack. It is a threat reduction strategy.
The same task in a different environment carries a different emotional signature.
Now let's bring it all together, because procrastination is not one problem, it is a system. The task triggers a negative emotion. The amygdala registers the emotion as a threat. The prefrontal cortex goes partially offline.
Temporal discounting makes avoidance feel rational. Relief reinforces the avoidance.
Self-criticism loads more negative emotion onto the task. The loop tightens. Breaking the loop requires intervening at every level simultaneously. Name the emotion to reduce amygdala activation. Use implementation intentions to preload the response to avoidance urges. Reframe the task to reduce its emotional profile.
Apply self-compassion to remove the shame layer.
Design the environment to reduce background emotional noise. None of these are willpower strategies. All of them work at the level of the nervous system, below the level where procrastination is being generated. Willpower fails against procrastination
because willpower operates in the prefrontal cortex, which is already partially offline when the amygdala fires.
You cannot think your way out of an emotional response with the same system the emotional response has already partially disabled. You regulate the emotion, and then you do the task. Here is the final truth,
and it is the one that makes everything else make sense.
You are not a procrastinator. You are a person whose nervous system has learned to protect itself from tasks that feel threatening.
That protection made sense at some point.
It is now costing you more than it is protecting you. Understanding the mechanism does not remove it immediately, but it removes the shame. And without the shame, the task becomes slightly less threatening.
The amygdala fires slightly less.
The prefrontal cortex stays slightly more online. And sometimes, slightly is enough to start. If that changed how you understand your own resistance, subscribe to Daily Dose of Knowledge. Drop a comment with the task you have been putting off the longest. And explore our videos on psychology, self-help, neuroscience, human behavior,
and society. There is always something here that will shift the way you think.